Welcome. I'm Bruce Baker, and this is another video in the History of New Orleans series. And today we're talking with Dr. Anthony Stanonis, historian of New Orleans, and we're going to talk about Mardi Gras, which is something that he's written quite a bit about, part of a book and 2 or 3 journal articles, and also has sort of lifelong personal experience with, since he indeed is from New Orleans. If we can start out with Mardi Gras in the context of 1920s and 1930s development of tourism, how does the increase in tourism in New Orleans by the 1930s sort of affect Mardi Gras and the role that it plays in the lives of the city's residents? I mean, we know that it's a big draw for the tourists then right up to the present, but how does the increase in tourism change the way that the residents of New Orleans look at it?
The thing, coming out of the First World War, there's panic in New Orleans about where the economy of the city is going. Partly that's because increasingly transportation is occurring on automobiles and commerce is occurring on trucks, which is competing with more traditional things like railroads and shipping. But culturally as well, the First World War has led to the success of Prohibition, right? Which is a hammer blow to the local culture, right? Which has celebrated its sort of French and Spanish ties, having these business meetings over some booze and cigars, right? How does the city attract tourists if its focus has been on being French, right, as a selling point, when so much of French culture, which has been experienced by millions of Americans because of their presence in France during the First World War, how do you sell that French culture if there's no wine and no alcohol and all the things that are associated with that aspect of society, the hospitality side of things? And so there's a real panic. Now, Mardi Gras was the keystone, and still is the keystone to the tourism industry in New Orleans. It was a major draw really since the Civil War, as crews started to parade more and more through the street. But that Mardi Gras and those crews, organizations that would organize parades, were far more political, right? They were organized in response to Reconstruction and the Civil War. Old Southern families, white families that wanted to restore their power as African Americans were getting the vote. Right? And so this was a way for the local families to parade through the streets and show their economic might and show their racial superiority, which has a long history within Mardi Gras and is controversial even now. There's a big debate going on within the crew of Knicks, which is an all-female crew about the Black Lives Matter movement, and a huge tension point at the moment in the city, even today. So you have a Mardi Gras that has largely been political. It does attract tourists, but by the 1920s, right, with this impact of the First World War and the impact of Prohibition, and along with that, the closure of Storyville, which was the legal brothel district that had been around since the late 1890s and had been a cornerstone of the sort of convention trade, because businessmen could go off and sneak off as they come to New Orleans to get, to do business, but they're also away from their families and the prying eyes of their local communities. Tourism was very much built around the brothels. So without brothels, without alcohol, what is Mardi Gras all about in this new era? And so what you see is the business community coming together and redefining Mardi Gras. And it's one of the things I say, it's a democratization of Mardi Gras. There's all this movement to create more parades, to lengthen out the carnival calendar by having more days of parades, to make it a more popular event where people are going into the streets, and most significantly, the development of carnival for us. I have just so y'all can see, right? Those cheap beads. In the 1920s, they were typically made of glass, right? And brought in from parts of Europe. And you would give those out to the people who were there. And it's sort of multiple purposes. One, it was a souvenir of your time in New Orleans. You could take it back and it would help promote further travel to New Orleans. But it also created competition in the streets, right? It created interaction between people who were, mixing with locals, but they were oftentimes strangers, right? And so it created conversation, it created a sense of community as people caught these different throws and talked about what they caught. They'd also throw out little doubloons, little wooden coins, or now they're aluminum coins that had images of the crew and the different floats on it. So it created a public spectacle. So the floats were something to look at, but the crowd itself was part of this interactive experience. It became an experience. It wasn't just something that you see, right? Sort of like the Thanksgiving Day parade in New York, you just sort of see it as it passes by, right? Whereas the carnival in New Orleans was this interactive thing. And that's a big part of what happens in the interwar period about changing carnival. So the crews were still political, and they still had, all these issues that are going on with local government, but they were also very much focused on developing a spectacle that was interactive, that could draw people and make people all over the world want to come to the city and experience that event. Right? And over the course of the interwar period, adding more and more crews. A great example of that is the crew of Hermes in 1937, which is actually organized partly through the Association of Commerce, a business organization, because one of the things that tourists were talking about was that they couldn't get into the exclusive carnival balls. So after a crew paraded, they would often have a carnival ball where all the debutantes would come out and dance, and the king and queen of the crew would parade, and tourists wanted to see that. But the old line crews that were born after the Civil War, crew of Rex, Comus, Momus, Proteus, the four old line, they have very exclusive local celebrations that were about local families showing their power to one another. And so tourists had to get those invitations only by knowing someone in New Orleans. Whereas the crew of Hermes, they had a ball where they could actually sell tickets to tourists, right? And tourists could experience what a New Orleans ball was like. So there's all these different ways that carnival is democratized. Hermes is also unique because it's the first parade that used electric lights, which is controversial. There's the traditionalists who believed in not using electric lights, using flambeau carriers. Flambeau carriers were typically African Americans who carried torches, which was, and I've seen this through, I think there's still a parade or two that still uses the traditional flambeau. Although I'm not too sure, because what a flambeau typically was a sort of a stick, right? It's an old school torch like you see in the Frankenstein movies, where you have rags soaked in tar or kerosene, and you light it up and you walk with it. And one of the things about that is it drips, right? Which is highly dangerous, but it was also part of the racial performance of what a crew was displaying. You have the white king and queen of a traditional old line crew, and then the African Americans who were walking along on the street level with these flambeaux that were dripping. Now I think most of them have switched to gas that still use natural flame, much safer. But still that has a racial element. Typically, those that are carrying even today the fire are African Americans.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, in general, what would you say that sort of what role does Mardi Gras play in the city's relationship to its own past, and how does that change in the, sort of through the interwar period? You've sort of talked about the democratization and sort of how the celebration of Carnival changes the relationship between the city and in itself and the city and tourists. But what role does it play in the depictions and sort of understandings of the past of New Orleans?
Mm-hmm. Uh, I mean, every year, right, the way these crews are put together and the floats, right, the way they're designed and what they present is a reimagining of the past. So if you get imagery of the different floats over the years, right, you can see the way New Orleanians are rethinking the city. So the famous examples are, of course, Reconstruction, where the very first cruise lampooned Grant. He was depicted as a tobacco grub. Uh, you know, there were all these political commentaries about the evils of Reconstruction through the floats. In the 1920s and you can see the embracing of classical mythology, right, which puts New Orleans in this sort of timeless image, that it's part of this ancient history. All of that, of course, is an invented tradition. But those parades and those floats create this timeless atmosphere, which allows people to be more liberal in their social interactions as well. But in some ways, that political element has always been around. In 1992, for instance, and this shocks people when you say it, was the first time that there was an ordinance passed within the city that mandated integration of Carnival crews. And that was highly controversial in 1992 and 93 because it was seen as an attack on the original crews like Rex, Momus, Comus, and Proteus, which had maintained a strictly white family socialite elite. Right? And those socialites and those elites controlled the old money in the city. So even though there's a democratization of Carnival in the 1920s and 30s, it really depends on the crew. Right? The old line crews maintained the old sort of Reconstruction era type of Carnival. Now, they weren't as overtly political as they were in Reconstruction, but that could change. Right? In 1992-93, we see overtly political lampoons of Dorothy May Taylor, the member of the city council that tried to, and succeeded in pushing through the ordinance that said you couldn't get a parade permit unless your organization made efforts to integrate and actually integrated. And in protest, several old line crews, Proteus, Momus, refused to parade. Comus as well. Rex is the one that stayed on the streets. Right? I think Comus left and then came back after several years when it realized that it wasn't going to be successful in holding off and getting this ordinance rescinded. So the other old line crews still exist, but they just don't parade because they can't get a parade permit.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. That's interesting. And as you say, I suppose looking at the visual record sort of allows us, an interesting kind of source for understanding historical memory in New Orleans that may not be available in other cities. So very interesting stuff.
There's some
Mardi Gras.
The newspapers would publish tableaus, right? They would publish these big centerpiece, full color images of floats. And, they're fascinating because if you look at the ones from the 20s and 30s when they started to publish these things, really to allow tourists who are in the city to take those back home with them, right? Because it's basically a photograph of every float, but they're etchings, full color. And you can see the influence of modern technology. There's one that I've got for one of the O-line crews that was celebrating radio, right? And it was like different songs you hear on the radio, right? And so there's this strange blending. It's a traditional float with traditional materials, you know, the sort of paper mache, and it was mule drawn through the city, but it's celebrating this modernity. And so, yeah, you can see how American society is changing in regards to those floats as well, not just the local politics and the local, but, you know, as more and more tourists come, right, you have to appeal to everyone, and you have to be sort of an ear to the ground to what's going on nationally. So lots of commentary about prohibition as well, and
Right, not
not
surprising.
pro, right? Not pro.
Yeah, I can imagine that it would be very favorable towards prohibition. I mentioned that carnival in 1933 or 34, whenever prohibition ended, I guess it would have been 34, was probably a bigger celebration than usual.
Well, I had this, you know, one of the best things I found when I was doing research for my book on New Orleans in like the mayor's records was there was a letter for something from the Association of Commerce, you know, a banquet, and at the bottom of the letter, and this is in the 1920s, it had BYOB. It's like, well, you know, clearly the politicians of the business really are not enforcing prohibition, right?
Well, that's an excellent excellent little bit of historical information to wrap up this discussion. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time to tell us all these interesting things about Mardi Gras, and particularly in the 1920s and 1930s.
Oh, thanks for having me on and having me talk about it.